Thank you, and I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill, which is the chickens coming home to roost bill, because none of what is before us here today should come as a surprise to anyone, and particularly anyone in government, because they've been made well aware of the issues that we're currently facing today over a long number of years. And we're told that the objective behind this particular piece of legislation is to provide temporary electricity generation to replace older power plants. And this is needed to replace the older power plants and to meet the growing demand for electricity caused by data centres. Now, interestingly, on the 7th of June 2018, after a very long and protracted and detailed set of discussions at Cabinet, the Government published its statement on the role of data centres in Ireland and its enterprise strategy related to that. And in that report there is a section on electricity infrastructure, highlighting the growing demand that will be placed on the electricity network by continuing to allow data centres to be given connections to the grid and being granted planning permission. And the report states that a large proportion of the existing and planned data centres are due to connect to the electricity system within the Dublin area, and based on existing data centres, committed expansion and expected growth, the total demand could treble within the next 10 years. And sadly, today, the legislation that we are dealing with is in a large part as a result of the unhindered approval of data centres connecting to the electricity grid. And, you know, this particular report goes on to highlight and point out, well, who's actually going to pick up the tab for this increased investment that needs to be put into the electricity generation, electricity transmission and distribution networks, because ultimately it is the electricity users that have to pay for that, the customers of the electricity suppliers, and they have to pay for it through their electricity bill. And that is done through, in part, the public service obligation, which is to meet the generation aspect of it. Then you have the transmission costs as well that are paid to EirGrid. And this particular report, produced in June of 2018, highlighted the impact that this would have on higher network charges, increased PSO levies, and that mitigating measures should be taken to minimise these charges to ordinary electricity customers. To date, absolutely nothing has been done to mitigate the cost of that, and you have families right across this country who are struggling to pay their electricity bill, having to decide between paying the electricity bill or putting food on the table, who are subsidising the electricity, the green electricity going into these data centres, who are subsidising the transmission costs and the distribution costs of that electricity going into those data centres. And this government continues to sit on its hands in relation to that issue. And as I told the Cabinet back in 2017-2018, it is immoral to be asking families that are struggling to pay their electricity bills to actually pay for the cost of this additional electricity going into the data centres. But that's exactly what the government is proposing to do with the legislation that is here before us today. Now, part of the problem that we have in relation to the need for these 450 megawatts of electricity is because we have decommissioned power stations. And the impression is being given here by government that this is to replace older power plants. But it's not. We're actually replacing some new kit as well. And in fact, I brought this to the floor of the House here on the 3rd of December 2020, when I questioned the Taoiseach in relation to the 2 power plants in Lanesborough and Shannonbridge, which Kieran Mulvey, the government's own Just Transition Commissioner, had said in his previous report. On the visit of the Just Transition team to both Shannonbridge and Lanesborough, we were impressed by the pristine state of the power stations. And why wouldn't they have a pristine state? Because they had, at that particular point in time, a 10-year lifespan left. And I pointed out to the Taoiseach on that day that we are effectively wasting €176 million of electricity customers' money that had been paid towards the cost of those 2 power plants, but was effectively being mothballed because of the decision being taken. And I said at the time that electricity customers in particular will foot the bill for the demolition of both of those pristine plants and have to pay for the alternative technology to provide replacement stability on the electricity grid. And here we are today, bringing forward legislation to do just that. Now, what's frustrating about this is that we did convince the government, and it was written into the programme for government, that there would be a review of all of this before any decision was taken. A steering group was established. Of course, the steering group involved the ESB, who had its own vested interest in ensuring both of those plants were decommissioned. And sadly now, electricity customers are have not only paid for the cost of those 2 plants that had a 10-year lifespan left on them, they're now paying for the replacement 250 megawatts of electricity that could be produced from both of those plants today, and they're paying for that now in the legislation that's being brought forward here. And I pointed out back just over 2 years ago, that let us not make the mistakes that we made in the past when we demolished our 2 sugar plants in Mallow and Carlow, which I again argued against at the time. Do not repeat those mistakes. And sadly, we are now repeating those mistakes, and now we're asking the electricity customers of this country, the families that are struggling to pay their electricity bills, to actually foot the cost of this irresponsible decision that was taken. Now, the argument will be made that, well, look, we can't continue to burn peat. And I don't make that argument whatsoever. And I didn't make that argument back in 2019 and 2020. I didn't make that argument when I was Minister either. But there is substantial biomass available if we issued licensing for the thinning and the felling of forestry in this country. There is plenty of brash that could be brought in and supplied to those 2 power plants today. And Bordnamona at the time had set up Bioenergy Ireland to look at sourcing indigenous biomass. And in fact, with just €33 million of an investment, we could actually get farmers to plant 10,000 hectares of willow over a 3-year period that would actually supply both of those 2 power plants. And that can be done tomorrow morning if the political will is there to do it. Now, the argument to be made in relation to the planning permission, and yes, it would require emergency legislation brought forward here, as it would in relation to Derrybrine. But does it make sense for, in the middle of a climate emergency, to be bringing forward emergency legislation here to invest in fossil fuel power generation when we have alternatives in terms of biomass and wind available to us, but the government are not prepared to engage on that particular objective? And I note today many of us received correspondence from the Irish Farmers Journal, in relation to the targets that, of climate reductions that agriculture will have to achieve by 2030. And I know this is an issue that will be debated quite heatedly, I suspect, at Cabinet over the next few weeks, whether we should be looking at a 22% reduction in agricultural emissions or a 30% reduction in agricultural emissions, or somewhere in between. And the reality is that managing our land far better would take carbon dioxide actually out of our atmosphere, reducing the harmful effects of climate and improving our oceans far quicker than just shooting down agriculture. And one of the ways to do that would be to support farmers to actually grow biomass within the vicinity of our 3 peat-fired power stations, Lanesborough and Shannonbridge, that are decommissioned, and the only one that's currently operational, in Edenderry. And if we supplied 100% locally sourced biomass to those plants, this would reduce agricultural emissions on local farms by 600,000 tonnes of carbon each year. It would be the equivalent of removing 130,000 cars off our roads, generating €465 per hectare, with a price of carbon at €100 per tonne. It would also create 4,000 seasonal jobs in the harvesting and guaranteeing incomes to farmers in the Midlands. And what we could do is use the Bord-na-Móna rail network that is still there to actually transport that biomass into those 3 power plants, rather than bringing them on road. So it's about a small bit of joined-up thinking, and this should, as I say, not come as a surprise to government. These were discussions I've had at Cabinet with some of the members of government that are there today. These are discussions that I've engaged with the Department of Energy, and people are well aware of the alternatives, but we're better off investing in fossil fuels and asking struggling families to pay for it, and I believe that that's immoral.